Welcome to Indonesia Political Focus. I'm your host, and today we're examining the key political developments across Indonesia during April 2025. This month has been marked by widespread protests against the proposed TNI Law revision and President Prabowo Subianto's significant diplomatic outreach to Turkey. Today we'll be covering these protests and state visits, analyzing power dynamics within Prabowo's cabinet, exploring regional election controversies, and examining how Indonesia is navigating international trade tensions with the United States. April 2025 presented a complex political landscape for Indonesia, characterized by domestic unrest and strategic international engagements. The month was dominated by continuing protests against the proposed TNI Law revision, with demonstrations spreading across major cities including Surabaya, Yogyakarta, and Jakarta. These protests, which began in February, reflect growing public concern about the potential for increased military influence in civilian governance, a sensitive issue given Indonesia's history with military involvement in politics. The demonstrations have become the defining challenge of President Prabowo's early administration, particularly noteworthy given his own military background. Meanwhile, Prabowo sought to strengthen Indonesia's international standing through diplomatic initiatives, most notably his state visit to Turkey. This outreach occurs against the backdrop of trade tensions with the United States, as Indonesia made significant concessions to avoid threatened tariffs on its exports. Internally, the government continues to navigate tensions between Prabowo's leadership and the lingering influence of former President Joko Widodo, creating a politically delicate balance of power within the cabinet itself. The most contentious policy matter this month has been the proposed revision to the Indonesian National Armed Forces, TNI Law. Critics argue this revision could weaken civilian supremacy and potentially reintroduce the military's dual function in politics, a significant reversal of post-1998 democratic reforms. While specific details of the draft law are still being debated, the proposal has sparked significant public backlash, with protesters demanding it be rejected, active TNI officers be removed from civilian positions, and democratic reforms be upheld. In economic policy, the government announced major trade concessions to the United States on April 8th to avoid a threatened 32% tariff on Indonesian exports. These concessions include commitments to purchase U.S. liquefied petroleum gas, natural gas, and soybeans, alongside reduced import duties on American steel, mining products, and health equipment. Additionally, taxes on electronics like mobile phones and laptops were lowered from 2.5% to 0.5% for all countries. A high-level delegation led by Chief Economic Minister Airlangga Hartarto traveled to Washington on April 17th to negotiate these terms, aiming to protect Indonesia's $14.3 billion trade surplus with the U.S. Executive initiatives continued with the ongoing implementation of the Daya Anegata Nusantara, Danantara Sovereign Wealth Fund, which now manages assets worth approximately $20 billion across 20 strategic projects spanning downstream industries, artificial intelligence research, and infrastructure development. A significant undercurrent in April's political landscape was the continuing influence of former President Joko Widodo within the Prabowo administration. Reports indicated that several cabinet ministers visited Jokowi in Surakarta during Idul Fitri celebrations, referring to him as boss, raising questions about divided loyalties. This dynamic is particularly sensitive given that Prabowo's vice president, Gibran Rakebuming Raka, is Jokowi's son. Gerindra's Secretary General, Ahmad Muzani, defended these visits as cultural traditions, but analysts like Nikki Farzal from CSIS noted Jokowi's enduring influence represents a challenge to Prabowo's leadership consolidation. President Prabowo explicitly addressed these concerns, calling for unity during a conversation with Coordinating Social Empowerment Minister Muhaimin Iskandar, and emphasizing the need for a cohesive cabinet. The Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle, PDIP, faced its own challenges with a high-profile bribery case involving Secretary General Hasto Kristianto and former KPU member Wahyu Setiawan. Allegations suggested that PDIP chairwoman Megawati Soekarnoputri might have been involved, though party officials denied these claims. Regionally, tensions emerged over proposals to grant special administrative status to Surakarta, Jokowi's hometown. The PDIP, which views Central Java as a traditional stronghold, opposed this move, with party figures arguing that Surakarta's existing status and economic challenges make such a designation unnecessary. Public engagement was robust throughout April, primarily driven by widespread protests against the proposed TNI Law revision. These demonstrations, part of the broader movement that began in February, occurred in multiple cities with demands focused on maintaining civilian supremacy over the military. Led by groups like the All-Indonesian Students' Union, BEMSI, these protests sometimes turned violent, with reports of 18 journalists and other participants being injured. The movement gained international solidarity, with supporting actions documented in the United States, Australia, and Germany. Social media amplified these concerns, with the hashtag Talak Rutni gaining significant traction across platforms, reflecting deep public discontent with perceived militarization efforts. In other areas of public discourse, President Prabowo's decision to send a representative to Pope Francis' funeral on April 26, rather than attend personally, generated some discussion about Indonesia's diplomatic approach to interfaith relations. The government's trade concessions to the United States also sparked debate among analysts and industry stakeholders, with concerns about potential long-term harm to local industries, though direct public response to these economic measures was less prominent than the TNI Law protests. Regional politics in April featured significant controversies surrounding election results across multiple areas. The General Elections Commission, KPU, ordered revotes in 24 regions following irregularities in the 2024 regional elections, but these remedial efforts generated further complications. 7 regions saw challenges to their revote results, including particularly contentious disputes in Banjarbaru, South Kalimantan, where allegations of voter bribery emerged. These controversies raised serious questions about the KPU's ability to ensure fair elections, with initial hearings for disputes scheduled for late April. The push for special administrative status for 6 regions, including Surakarta, generated political friction with the PDIP party. Party figures including Arya Bima and former Mayor FX Hadi Rudiatmo argued against the proposal, citing Surakarta's existing economic status and persistent poverty issues. This conflict underscores the complex regional power struggles occurring across Indonesia, with the PDIP's influence in Central Java being tested following electoral setbacks in 2024. These regional dynamics illustrate the ongoing challenges in balancing local governance ambitions with national political considerations, particularly in regions with strong historical ties to political figures like former President Jokowi. The intersection of economic and political factors was particularly evident in April's developments. The government's trade concessions to the United States directly responded to international economic pressures, with the threat of a 32% tariff forcing adjustments to domestic policy. While these concessions aim to protect Indonesia's substantial trade surplus, they've raised concerns about impacts on local industries and national economic sovereignty. Domestically, the Free Nutritious Meal Program linked to Presidential Instruction No. 1 of 2025 has become politically contentious due to associated budget cuts. These economic policies contributed significantly to the broader protests, as students and activists criticized resource allocation decisions. The Danantara Sovereign Wealth Fund's ongoing implementation represents another economic initiative with profound political implications. Managing assets worth approximately 300 trillion Indonesian rupiah across strategic sectors. The fund's governance and investment choices directly influence political narratives about state resource management and economic development priorities. The government's Bullion Bank Service, launched earlier this year to manage domestic gold storage and trade, continues to develop as part of a broader strategy for economic sovereignty. This initiative addresses the historical outflow of Indonesian mined gold and represents an attempt to strengthen national control over valuable resources. These economic policies collectively demonstrate how financial decisions directly shape political stability and public sentiment, creating governance challenges that the Prabowo administration must navigate carefully. Looking to May and beyond, several critical issues will likely shape Indonesia's political landscape. The ongoing U.S. trade negotiations remain pivotal, with a 60-day target to finalize agreements following the April concessions. The outcome will significantly influence local industries and broader economic stability. The Danantara Sovereign Wealth Fund's implementation will continue to face scrutiny over governance and market impacts. As a cornerstone of economic strategy, its success is crucial for growth objectives and government credibility. Political tensions, driven by Jokowi's lingering influence and internal cabinet dynamics, pose ongoing challenges to Prabowo's leadership. These tensions may intensify as the administration attempts to implement controversial policies, particularly around military affairs and regional governance. Legal battles involving former President Jokowi and PDIP figures will likely continue, potentially destabilizing the political climate further. Regional election disputes require resolution to restore confidence in electoral processes. The most pressing question remains whether the government will modify its approach to the TNI Law revision in response to widespread protests, or whether it will maintain course despite public opposition. This decision will significantly impact political stability in the coming months. We should also watch for further developments in the Turkey-Indonesia relationship following Prabowo's successful state visit, particularly regarding increased trade volume and defense cooperation initiatives. April 2025 has demonstrated both the challenges and opportunities facing Indonesia's political landscape. President Prabowo's administration continues navigating the delicate balance between international diplomacy and domestic stability, while contending with the complex legacy of his predecessor. The protests against the TNI Law revision highlight enduring public concern about democratic governance and civilian oversight of the military, issues that remain central to Indonesia's political identity more than 2 decades after Reformasi. As we follow these developments, key questions emerge. Will Prabowo successfully consolidate his authority despite the lingering influence of former President Jokowi? And how will the administration balance its economic objectives with the democratic demands of an increasingly vocal civil society? This has been Indonesia Political Focus for April 2025. Thank you for listening.